We're ready. Okay. Good afternoon and welcome back, and thank you for staying with us before the lunch period. I know you're probably all hungry, but we do have a great discussion for you next on vaccination. I'm Helen Collis, a senior health journalist at Politico, and next we're talking about COVID vaccinations and the arrival of vaccines for the next pandemic, potentially. So the COVID pandemic, thankfully, is over. But the virus is still with us, and countries have begun vaccinating their most at-risk populations once again to protect them against severe disease and death this winter. But we don't have the same suite of vaccines available as last year, and questions have been raised over how countries will afford these vaccines going forwards. In addition, governments and the EU are trying to ensure they are ready to deploy vaccines against new pathogens in the future. As the next deadly virus may emerge, as we heard in the previous panel. But before we start, a few housekeeping rules. You can ask questions through the swap card platform, which you can scan the QR code here, or follow the instructions on our event website. And if you want to share anything you hear today, our hashtag is Politico Healthcare. So, joining me today, we have a great lineup. Starting from my left here, we have Mika Salminen, Director of Public Health and Welfare at the Finnish National Institute for Health and Welfare. Nice to see you. Pierre van Dam, Professor of Vaccinology and Infectious Diseases from Antwerp University. Sylvia Taylor, Executive Vice President, Chief of Corporate Affairs and Advocacy Officer at Novavax.
Good to see you.
Marco Cavalieri, Head of Anti-Infectives and Vaccines at the European Medicines Agency. And last but not least, Jakub Dvoracek, Deputy Health Minister from the Czech Republic. Thank you for joining us. So, it's been close to 3 years now since the first COVID vaccines began being administered to millions of people. I remember it well. Since then, some of the vaccines have been updated, some of them more than once, and people who can receive them have now been restricted to those who are most at highest risk. But are people still coming forwards? Jakub, as you have oversight in the Health Ministry in the Czech Republic, can you set the scene for us with regards to this season's vaccination campaigns for COVID? Are people coming forward who are eligible?
No, thank you very much for this opportunity, and I'm really happy to be here. I would say, we are in quite special situation because if I take the supplies of vaccine, if I take the number of people who are now coming for vaccination for COVID, it's quite high. For 10 million population, 10,000 a day, which is quite a nice number. And you would say that after the years, we will have, the very clear pathway, to get the vaccines and to administer the vaccines for COVID-19. But sometimes it's not happening, and still, we have millions of vaccines which we are destroying. And at the same time, if I see the current consumption, it will be really tight, to have the vaccines for everybody who is coming, based on the supplies and based on the way, how the last vaccines coming to people, and also because of the situation now in a number of European countries is that we have one supplier.
Are you able to tell us if the vaccination rate is falling significantly in Czech Republic? Have you got any statistics on that?
As I said, we were quite surprised how the uptake, of the people, who comes for the vaccination, how it is high. And as I said, we are now very close to the situation that we will maybe, and hopefully not, that we will not have enough vaccine, those updated vaccines for all people. But it's look promising. It's we will manage, but it's quite strange situation.
Mika, can you tell us what the vaccination campaign is like in Finland at the moment? Is it a similar story or is it different?
I think it's quite similar. What we actually have seen, and this is a very positive thing, already last year we combined the COVID vaccination with our regular influenza vaccination campaign, and the target groups were quite similar. And that has been a successful strategy for us, and we see we have increased the influenza vaccination coverage among those most vulnerable, elderly, and other target groups. And I think we are seeing the same now. We are actually only starting now. So I don't have the coverage numbers yet, but so far, based on consumption, it looks good.
And for both of these countries, as our country reps here, how difficult has it been to relaunch these campaigns every few months? It seems like we're going into more of a seasonal approach now, a bit like influenza. How much extra uplift is there for the workforce to really deliver these campaigns?
Well, it is a challenge. It is definitely a challenge. When we go back to the sort of the years back, and we didn't have a clear view, understandably, on what the best sort of regimen would be and how many boosters or additional doses you would need and who would need them. It was quite difficult because decisions and also the sort of availability of vaccines was not so predictable. It's getting better now, and what we are seeing is that if we can get into a sort of predictable schedule with predictable production also and supply, I don't think it's going to be a big problem because we have the routine system at least once a year, which we can mobilize in, which is sort of part of the regular health care system. So we are hoping very much that this could be a normal part of the regular schedule in Finland. Now we are looking at, of course, the global guidance. The WHO is coming out, I think, today actually with their global guidance, and we're looking at what EMA and the ECDC is saying, of course, also. But so far it looks quite similar to what we would think about the influenza. There is the issue about the licensing, though, still, and the market authorization. We would, of course, hope that we would have choice on the market for multiple reasons: price, suitability for certain risk groups, and so on. And also, if you have everything in the single basket, you take a risk also with production problems sometimes happening. So there are still challenges, but we are going towards maybe a more normalized situation.
We'll come to those points a bit later, but I just wanted to bring Marco into the discussion here. Marco, you have oversight at the European Medicines Agency of the whole of Europe's vaccination campaigns, working with the ECDC. Are you able to give us any insight at this stage? I know it's early in the season, as to whether or not we're seeing the uptake rates that we need to protect citizens this winter.
Yeah, I was very glad to hear that at least in 2 European countries things are going well, but I'm not hearing this message from each corner of Europe. So things are still a bit unsettled, and it looks like, vaccination fatigue is still there. And moreover, it is very difficult to transmit to the population the fact that, of course, we are out of the pandemic as it stands, but still the virus is with us. So, people try to think that it's either pandemic or nothing. Well, there is an in-between that is still extremely insidious, and we need to think about how to protect those that are most vulnerable to this virus, including the elderly and those with comorbidities, and convince them that it's important that they get revaccinated. So I still see a lot of work to be done, not forgetting all the disruption that came from vaccine misinformation and disinformation. And of course, we have been at the front line to try to tackle that, but I can tell you it's not been easy, and it's still not easy. And still we got a lot of things to be done in order to set the message on the science in the right way. And that's what we will continue to be doing. So I believe there is more to be done. And of course, let's not forget that even for influenza, the vaccination rate in Europe were not according to what was the target of 70% in the risk group. So even for that, we have not been able, apart from very few countries, to get there. So there is still a lot of work to be done in convincing those that are at risk to get vaccinated for COVID, for influenza, and in the future, maybe RSV or other pathogens for which we will have vaccines.
Pierre, you're our academic on the panel. Can you share with us any insights as to what Marco was saying here and the really need to regain trust in really boosting up those vaccination rates, not only in flu, but also for COVID?
Well, absolutely. In fact, what we hear this morning in this panel is, on the one hand, you have the availability. On the other hand, it is the demand. And on the demand side, what we see is that At this moment, on the media, there is almost no communication about immunization, about COVID, about flu. In fact, today it's the World Polio Day. I heard not a lot about that neither, and I think there is a lot to celebrate about that. So people, it's like it's very far from their bed, and that needs to change. Also, I would say, in general, the public goes to the pharmacist and the GP to ask their questions about immunization because they trust these healthcare provider. And I think that's something we need to keep. But if you ask on the side of the healthcare provider whether they are well trained and whether they can answer the questions, then you see that more than 50% will say, I can't answer these questions. And then a question mark is on their face, and that's not good for the confidence between the general population on the one hand and the healthcare provider on the other hand. So we really have to feed our healthcare provider, our medical students, with good knowledge, with all that is available in terms of science, so that they can answer the questions. And that will raise the confidence. Whether it is for flu, and as you say, the coverage for the moment is not optimal for flu neither. So if we take flu as an example for COVID-19, it's not a good example. We need really to do better. And the only way is to invest in our healthcare providers force all over the EU, in the medical training, but also the training afterwards, webinars and so on. And also to communicate in a good way to the general public.
Do you know, we've mentioned it, and I will come to it, we've got fewer vaccines available for this COVID season. Do we know if having fewer vaccines available has any impact on people's trust of what's available and whether they're going to take it?
I'm not aware of that in my country, so I must say that's a third country where it goes very well for the moment, at least in the groups, the risk groups where the COVID-19 vaccine has been targeted, and we try, of course, to mimic what happens with flu, but the unavailability, I would say, of more vaccines at this moment is not really a key issue for the decision makers or for the general public. But I can imagine that it would increase at some point the coverage in certain risk groups, definitely.
Sylvia, I will bring you in just a moment, but I just... you can go ahead. I'm going to obviously set the scene with regards to why we have only got one vaccine really on the market at the moment, well, widespread on the market. We know that European Commission secured a years-long contract with the Pfizer-BioNTech team for their mRNA COVID vaccine until the end of 2026. Moderna's mRNA vaccine is available this year as well, but not much beyond that. The same for the Novavax vaccine. And we now know, however, that the Sanofi vaccine has not been updated. Valneva's vaccine is no longer available, and they say they're no longer manufacturing it. Are there any risks to what looks like picking a winner here for the long-term vaccination campaigns? Who would like to come in first, Sylvia or Jakob?
Yeah, I mean,
go ahead.
I'll speak from the standpoint of industry, right? And I think, kind of playing off of what you had said, we actually do have a significant amount of research that shows that having choice in technology platforms, having choice in vaccines, you mentioned flu, much like we see in flu, actually helps to normalize COVID vaccination. And that's really important. And ultimately, that helps make people more confident in getting a COVID vaccine, and we believe will help drive vaccination rates. On the issue of having multiple technology platforms, I think that's really, really important. Not just from a security standpoint, you want some element of redundancy, multiple options, as we saw in the pandemic, right? I think what Europe did really well in the beginning of the pandemic was to have multiple technology platforms available. I think right now we see a risk of moving to something that is more like single source supplier. From the industry side, we need predictability. We need to understand transparency. What is the demand? What is needed in Europe? And we need to plan for it. There's significant investment required on the industry side. So we think it's absolutely important to have multiple technology platforms, and anything that goes away from that for us is problematic.
Mm-hmm. And Jakob, you were going to come in.
Just to confirm it, what was mentioned, but it's also good to say that what we created is a system which safely delivered the enough vaccines, for the population. But we can also see there is a number of people who don't want to have the vaccines based on the messenger RNA technology, and we have to have definitely, the more vaccines, which are available for the people. But unfortunately, if we see, what we created is the situation where the states invested we are using the public money, and usually not the money, from the health insurance. We are using usually the money from the budget of the states, because we are purchasing directly. We pay, from different sources than is usual. And this is also creating quite a hurdle for a number of the other producers. So at the current situation, we see that we created something like a vendor lock, for the Europe, which was, of course, very important at the beginning. But now, we have a difficulty to really ensure the other producers that we will be able to reimburse and we will be able to deliver those vaccines for the people who wants the different vaccine.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And a really good point then. I wanted to bring in Marco to really share with us some of the sort of regulatory perspective on this and the scientific perspective of any risks that you see with having one vaccine.
Well, I think at the EMA we have been consistent throughout the pandemic, and we are maintaining this consistency on the fact that we believe that a broader portfolio of options is a wise strategy. So we still believe that having more than one option is a good thing, because you never know what may happen with the manufacturing on any issue that could come up. So having multiple manufacturers is important. And that's why we've always been advocating for finding solutions for rapid approval, also for other vaccines that might take a little bit longer to update their composition. And that's what we will be discussing from now on, because we want to define a viable process and pathway that could lead to a rapid approval also for protein-based vaccines, such as the one from Novavax or others that will be available in Europe. And of course, as you know, this will have to fit into a more global discussion with WHO and other players such as the US FDA. And this year, we spent a lot of time really working together behind the scenes to try to come up with an alignment on the composition of the updated vaccine. But of course, it remains that we have to do more in figuring out a date for the decision that is a bit earlier than what, for example, the FDA is looking into, which is June of each year, with their advisory committee. But if you wait until June, other platform technology different from messenger RNA will have difficulties in coming up with a vaccine that can be used. So we need to solve this out and to find pragmatic way in which maybe a preliminary decision can be taken earlier, so that, also these type of vaccines could update their composition and be available for the vaccination campaign.
For comparison, when do we hear about the flu vaccine composition?
That happens in March.
Okay.
It's quite early. The point here is that SARS-CoV-2 is still a bit of an unpredictable virus. It's not like flu, so it's not even fully seasonal to start with. We go with once a year seasonal vaccination, like in the northern hemisphere in autumn, because we know that the burden of disease in winter will be higher anyway, and you could give it together with the influenza vaccine. But it's true that the virus is circulating all year round for now. It will change probably, but we are not yet there. So it's a bit of a different process. And here the point that the virus being unpredictable and having technology such as messenger RNA that can be very fast in updating, there was a desire, at least in the United States, to take the decision as late as possible, so that you will have more certainty about the matching of the strain in the vaccine versus what is in circulation. But we know that you cannot be perfect. So anyway, you will not match exactly what will be in circulation, a few months down the line. So maybe a more pragmatic approach would make sense.
Sounds like a different balancing act. Stefan, did you want to?
I just want to make the point that it's not because the general public accepts a certain vaccine today that it will be tomorrow. So having indeed several platforms is a kind of de-risking the whole campaign at the level of having the availability of several products on the one hand. On the other hand, also, if you have production difficulties, contamination problems, you can't depend from one product. And that's something we also need to take into consideration.
Very good point. Sylvia, we know that that Novavax is the only non-mRNA vaccine for COVID to be updated against the regulators the variant that regulators requested earlier this year, but it's not yet been approved in Europe. With the European contract for the vaccine coming to an end fairly soon, is time running out to get this updated vaccine to European citizens before the contract ends?
I don't think so. I feel really good about the progress that we're making, working in partnership with Emma, who's sitting right next to me. I think for us, you're right, our contract ends at the end of the year. We have, I think, plenty of time to conclude the regulatory process and then ultimately get vaccine to the member states that we know want it. I think what's important here is the desire for a protein-based option that's been updated, and I think that's going to, outweigh any other considerations. So we feel good about the timing.
And is Novavax likely to continue to update its vaccine each year? How much of that decision comes down to the procurement contracts that are going to be in place in Europe, in member states, based on that decision?
Yeah, I would say it has everything to do with where public health authorities, regulators, say the vaccine needs to go. If it needs to be updated, we will update it. It has nothing to do with the contracts, right? First and foremost, we seek to serve public health, to make a vaccine available that is going to meet the needs of the people who are going to use it. So I think for us, if that's what ends up happening, count us in. That's exactly what we'll be doing. But also working with this ecosystem of people, as you say, Dr. Cavallari, who are potentially working to find ways to accelerate the process, bring it forward a little bit more, something that looks a little bit more like the flu process, I think would be very helpful, because you basically, work forward from that, but backward from the start of the season. And so it definitely is a very truncated, short amount of time within which to do all the things that are required to develop and then get authorized an updated vaccine.
And yes, I can come in.
No, just back to what was mentioned. Of course, the registration is important and approval and so on. But if we will stay with the current system of procurement, it will anyway be very difficult to get to the market. We still rely, on the system, which means, that the states needs to set up the agreement, pay in advance for a certain amount of vaccines. But we have to come back, to the normal system where the reimbursement is based, on the need of the state, and it's reimbursed directly from the health budget. And this is something what we still miss, in the area of COVID-19 vaccines. Doesn't matter if it's Pfizer, Moderna, or the Novavax. Still, they think that the states will be able to keep the same contracting as it was in the past, which is not the case. If you have, as government, the agreement which is covering the nearly whole population till 2026, and if the other companies will not change their approach and they will not come to, let's say, the normal way of reimbursement through the health insurance funds, then we will be in the very difficult situation, even with the approval and with the existing vaccines.
Mika, talking about the situation in Finland, what would be the best outcome for Finland? Should we be looking for more long-term COVID-19 contracts for other vaccine makers, or should we now be focusing on going to national reimbursement procedures in the same way that other vaccines are paid for?
I think it's actually almost absolutely necessary that we go to the normal schedule, normal type of system with the COVID vaccines. There's no sort of a priori reason why COVID should be in a different position in this regard. So I think some very sort of serious negotiation needs to be done both on the European level and on the national level with the companies that might resist this model. I think it's better for everyone that we do not make this a special case forever. It would solve a lot of problems because, for example, in Finland, we have a single-payer system, so it's not such a huge issue for us. But because the vaccine is not in the sort of regular market, our private sector cannot really access it, and that creates a problem for us. It would solve a lot of things if these would have the normal market authorization, and you could buy it based on the regular rules and make the normal contracts as we do with any other vaccine purchases. So we are all for going to the normalization.
And Sylvia, can you share with us any insights from Novavax's perspective? Is the company in favour of another EU contract? Is that something you're working to prepare for and hopefully sign? Or are you going to the member states potentially with the updated vaccine from next year to make sure people continue to have that access?
I think first and foremost at Novavax, we're in favor of anything that meets the needs of our customers, right? And so I think a more local, national approach helps us to do that. It helps us to plan, helps us to make sure that we're ensuring the needs of the different markets, because we do find there's diversity with each of the member states in their vaccination rates, as we've heard today, in their approach to vaccination. So I think that's a good framework to work within. You know, we also, because we need certainty and transparency, I think anything where we have a national system or a pan-European, I should say, system of procurement also makes sense. So I think ultimately it's creating the right framework that allows us to get our vaccine to the right people at the right time.
Changing tack slightly and thinking about the next health threat. We heard on this earlier panel from Saul Walker at CEPI that in order to accelerate the development of vaccines against the next threat, we need to think about sharing risks, costs and benefits ahead of the next crisis and really getting ahead in the development of new vaccines. And I just wanted to get your response to that and how that would look like and if it's even possible. Maybe Sylvia, I'll go back to you.
Yeah, I mean, I think what's important to know is while the pandemic reared, its head and it seemed like overnight vaccine candidates appeared, that wasn't the case. We were working for decades, actually, perfecting our technology platform and getting ready for the moment. In fact, in March of 2020, we were going to be an influenza company because we were developing we had a phase 3 influenza candidate, and that's the direction we were going. And then we were able to just pivot. And so I think that's what's going to be really important. I think, always investing in research and development, always being vigilant, and being part of this ecosystem of people who are surveilling the market, understanding what's required and where technology is going to go. I mean, we're right now focused on COVID-19, but we're already thinking several steps ahead, be it a COVID combination with influenza or pandemic influenza vaccines.
Mm-hmm. And Marco, that's your role at the EMA, preparing for the next health threat. What work is the EMA doing to really make sure we can get vaccines even quicker next time?
Yeah, no, I think here is, it's always important to work in preparedness. What you achieve during response is how good you have been during preparedness. And I always been a strong believer on the fact that we need to advance a prototype vaccine in peacetime against prototype viruses or pathogens, and maybe reach to the point that we can authorize them similarly to what we do, for example, for pandemic influenza, that we have this concept of pandemic preparedness vaccines that are authorized but not yet marketed and kept on the shelf so that when the pandemic strikes, you simply change the strain of the virus and then you're ready to go with a vaccine that could tackle the pandemic. So now what we are exploring is to broaden this concept to other type of pathogens, starting with coronaviruses. I've been engaging a lot with NIH and CEPI, indeed, on the concept of building new vaccines that could be pan-coronaviruses or could have activity against other of the thousands of bad coronaviruses that are out there and may cause a pandemic tomorrow. So we need to think how to secure a market authorization for this type of vaccine without the need of using them straight away, because of course nobody needs to be vaccinated today against many of these bad coronaviruses, or even for MERS, if you think about it, unless you live in the Arabic Peninsula, there is no need for that. So it's really bringing forward this concept and to really figure out new approaches so that we could advance these vaccines before the actual crisis strikes. But you will have something on the shelf that will be your prototype vaccine that you can adapt and then use when the actual pandemic strain will come. So we are really working on that. It's a new concept. And also advancing vaccines for diseases for which it's impossible to generate clinical efficacy data now. For example, we have been strongly advocating the need of new Ebola vaccines, and we are authorized the one Ebola vaccine. We've been the only authorities or the first authority in the world to authorize that vaccine based on immunobridging from animal models. And we need to do that because this is the only way to really come to something that is authorized, is controlled from the regulatory side, the manufacturer is controlled, you have a plan how to collect data post-approval. So we strongly believe that this is the way to go, and we have to do it across a number of different pathogens that might cause outbreaks in the future.
And Helen, I was just going to add, this is, I think, a very practical way to take some of the lessons learned from a pandemic and apply it for being ready the next time. One of the things I think that we saw is that consumer confidence is so incredibly important. So if we create such a process, we have to talk about it, we have to publicize it, we have to talk about all of the rigor that goes into not only development, but review of the vaccines. So we may have done during the pandemic, in 1 to 2 years, what normally takes 8 to 10, but it was without cutting corners on safety, which vaccines have to be first and foremost safe then efficacious.
And you are exactly right. And I wanted to bring in to Pierre to that discussion. If we are finding ways to even accelerate that fast process that we saw in the pandemic of developing vaccines, testing them, developing them, testing them, regulating them, manufacturing them, what is the impact it might have on patients' uptake of it? And like Sylvia said, how are we going to communicate those processes, complex processes, to citizens to make sure that they do take vaccines?
I think we have to use the peacetime now to communicate these processes. We don't have to wait for a next pandemic to communicate. Again, I would say in 48 hours what we do, because that's like, this is too fast, and we know that argument was used. We have to communicate now how much is invested in new technologies, new platforms, how we can guarantee safety, and this is a role for the industry as well as for the public health, the ministries of health, the academia. So I think that's really an important role. We have also to measure the confidence that is existing among people. There was a survey every 2 years done by the EU to really look at the confidence that people have in vaccines. 2016 was not good at all. Then it improved in 2018. Again, it further improved in 2020. And in 2022, it went back to the level of 2018. So we really have to invest in how can we improve the confidence that people have in technologies, in vaccines. And a lot has to do with communication. A lot has to do, again, with investing knowledge in the general practitioner, the pharmacist. Because, in fact, we know when you enter a pharmacy, the threshold is 0. That's where they ask their question. If the pharmacist is not able to answer, they will go and start Googling, and we know what they will find on the web. So we really have to educate people how to find the good information, validated information, how to deal with the negative information and the fake news. All that is an educational process we have to start in many countries at the same time, and in particular in peacetime.
And Mika, can you share some details?
Yeah, I think something that Jeremy Farrar said was very wise, and that's that when the crisis strikes, that's not when you build a system. That's you go with the system that you have. You can maybe tweak it a little bit, but you cannot change anyway. So I think the key issue is to build that trust during peacetime. That requires the sort of constant interaction with the public from not only the public health side, but also the industry and from government in general. What we see in our context in the Nordic countries that we followed, actually our government followed the sort of public sentiment every month. And in the beginning there was a small dip, but then actually the strongest trust was in public health officials, and even stronger in the healthcare system, whereas for the politicians it went down. So you have to keep communicating in peacetime so that you have the trust when the crisis comes. And that goes also for investing, because even if I'm saying now that we would like to have the normal system for the vaccines, this doesn't mean that we have no need to invest in the long-term preparedness. Actually, that's if we heard about the trillions that were lost due to the pandemic for the impact on whole of society. If we cannot put at least 1 trillion in the preparedness annually, we're going to pay for it later. So that would be a really good return on investment if we could really build a system where we can help the industry to keep the various technologies in place and accept that not all of them will become, a product which will be great, but the platforms will be there and we will have choice when the crisis comes. We buy to Finland will invest 1 billion in fighters. And if we never have to use them, that's the best scenario. The same goes for preparedness.
And Jakob, bringing in the Czech example here, how hard is it to really be the flag waver for investment in preparedness in the government and making sure that it doesn't slip by?
It will be probably not just the Czech perspective, but we have to really analyze, how the current system, which we put on the place in 2020, how it works. If we are really happy, if the member states are happy, if the industry is happy, and if we could repeat it, maybe modify it based on what we learned. But it's also visible, and it was quite nicely seen, when we had the discussion about the amendment of existing contracts. There were a number of member states which were quite unhappy, with the conditions, with the number of vaccines, etc., etc. So if we should be able in the future to repeat it and to say the clear signal to the industry that we have a tool how to procure as a EU, to have all this 450 million people, the power of the market, on this investment, then is great. But this learning, which will really, put the current feeling of member states, Commission, maybe also DG HERA, who did, for example, this procurement of monkeypox. Without that, there will be no clear pathway, for the industry, for the future, for this crisis situation. So it's not about the Czech or the Finland, but it's also, about the rest of the member states to say, okay, this was perfect, but this was maybe not, this was not working properly, and we have to prepare it for the next purchasing in much better way because we have this experience already.
What about a blueprint contract for the next purchasing at EU level? Would that be something that could work, or is it really dependent on the technologies and the different types of manufacturing processes?
I think it's really about the way, how we negotiate and how we set up the conditions of any different kind of contract, because it will be different, of course, based on the technology, based on the number of people who needs to be vaccinated, etc. But we had this experience, which were at the beginning really appreciated from all states. It's not this stage and not this condition now.
We're close to the end of our panel, so I just have one question for each of you. If you could give a mark out of 10 for Europe's response to really delivering vaccines to all of its citizens during the COVID pandemic, and one piece of advice for governments and the EU to improve upon next year to really make sure that we've got what we need when we need it. Mika.
Well, I'll just say from the start that I thought this was actually a fantastic example of Europe working together. We saved tons of lives. We probably saved a lot of money. Some countries would not have received the vaccines in time without the joint procurement. So I would give it a 9+. There were some things that could have been better, but for the time, it filled the gap that we really needed. I'm sure Finland would have been quite down on the list without the joint purchasing area, so 9+.
And to improve upon next time, to get that 10?
Well, it would be great to have these deals in place in advance and not when the crisis hits. Yeah.
Pierre.
Well, I thought a 9, but I can live with a 9+ as well, because same for Belgium. I think otherwise, as a small country, would never have had the vaccine in time. So the joint procurement was, I think, the very wise decision. At the same time, also making more than one vaccine available from the start of the pandemic was important, because we used all what was available to, I would say, offer protection to as many people as possible in a timely manner. And that, I think, is crucial. What I hope is that all of us would not forget what has happened in the previous 3 years. And I'm afraid that this is already starting. People think COVID is over, as you said. It's like a no-yes situation. It is. We are now in a transition, and we have just to use that period to be better prepared. If we can improve, I would say we should improve indeed in terms of communication at all levels, and that starts today. We have to improve the medical training and paramedical training at our universities. Marco knows it's a point I want to repeat, but I think if we look at the curricula of our doctors in Europe, it's a shame because vaccinology is treated very stepmotherly. And we really have to change that curriculum. And that also will be part of the preparedness and the readiness for the future.
Thank you. Sylvia?
So I learned early on, do not judge those whose shoes you do not walk in. So I will say that, look, I'm going to give it a 10. And you know, you've heard the phrase A for effort. Everybody was trying very hard to do the best they could with the tools they had at their disposal. And so that regard, you know, how can you judge that, right? I think industry, government, academia, you know, everybody. I think what, though, I see that's a little bit concerning is we're sliding a little bit backward. You know, all of a sudden we had this hope in vaccines and confidence, and now it's sliding backward. We saw vaccination rates rising, and now globally they're declining. So I think, you know, my piece of advice or way to implement a lesson learned would be, you know, while you're dealing with a critical emergency and you have to deal with what is right in front of you, plan a little bit more for what's going to happen afterward, right? So take steps that will help people, I think, maintain confidence in their vaccination and their choices, and make sure you're thinking about what's going to happen after the emergency is done, because it isn't binomial. It's not one and done. We really think that COVID now is here to stay.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Marco.
Well, if I look at what has been done during the pandemic, I would say 10, because, you know, the hectic work done for this joint procurement was really great. But I would downgrade to 8, because if we look at what was not done before the pandemic, I have to say that Europe did not do what was clearly going to happen. And, you know, we have been advocating because we have to remember that after the 2009 influenza pandemic, there was a lot of fatigue about the contracts, a lot of criticism. Why you spend so much money for vaccines that, you know, were very expensive, and the pandemic was not that serious in terms of burden of disease. So Europe tried to avoid the topic. But then we had Ebola, we had Zika, a lot of signal about all these health threats emerging, and nothing really happened in Europe until there was a big crisis such as COVID-19. So it would have been great if something was put in place even before that. And now I have to say the pandemic is over, but let's please not forget about it. Let's do what we were supposed to have done already before the pandemic, having an infrastructure and a system that could keep us better prepared with vaccines and therapeutics as well, procured, or at least, you know, with a view of funding the research for all these therapeutic and vaccines, so that we will have them on time when the next crisis will hit.
Thank you. Last but not least, Jakob.
Well, everything was said. The only thing, you know, which comes to my mind, you know, I mean, the communication and how we communicate and how we coordinate the communication between the member states. And it was obvious, you know, that number of very difficult moments we just created because, you know, the messages which we sent to population, to our people, were not, let's say, somehow unified. So there were different messaging in Germany, different messaging in Czech, maybe in Scandinavia, and because the people are now living in global world, you know, all those information then was easy to find it. And this kind of problem with aligning of the messaging creates a lot of question mark. And it's created a lot of trouble. And I see the role of ECDC and also the other bodies in the Commission to help us to align, you know, with the communication for the future. And I believe then it will be much easier to approach the people and to get the high level of vaccination at the moment we need it.
Fantastic. Well, thank you all so much for joining us. That's all we've got time for this afternoon. You've done a fantastic job of summing up what I was just about to say, so I'm not going to repeat what you've just said. I know we're all hungry and waiting to escape for lunch. We have an hour's break now for lunch, so please be back in time for the next session with Ashley on whatever happened to EU's BARDA. Thank you. Thank you.
This is an age of disruption, of profound revolutionary change.
What we're really asking ministers is to empower the ambassadors.
The only thing that you really push forth is the truth.
You don't see many women represented when it comes to the decisions as to how to handle the pandemic.